The first jolt felt small, but it was enough to ruin the calm of the entire flight. Lily's seat suddenly shuddered forward as if someone had kicked it from behind. Not hard enough to cause a scene, but sharp enough to make her shoulders tense instantly. Davis felt the vibration travel through his own seat too, a dull thump that climbed straight up his spine. The plane hummed steadily around them, engines roaring softly like distant thunder, but this movement was different. It was deliberate. Lily slowly turned her head. Hanging over the top of her seat was a bright red high heel. The shoe rested there like it owned the space. The long leg attached to it stretched from the row behind them, casually draped across the seatback as if the airplane cabin were someone's living room. Tap. The heel pressed down. Tap. Then again. Each little push sent a tremor through Lily's seat. Davis watched his wife carefully. Lily wasn't the type to overreact. She was calm by nature. The kind of person who believed most problems could be solved with simple politeness. Her fingers tightened slightly on the armrest as she took a slow breath. Around them the cabin lights dimmed as the plane settled into cruising altitude. Passengers were relaxing, some opening laptops, others putting on headphones. The smell of reheated coffee and recycled air floated through the rows. But that red heel remained planted firmly on Lily's seat. Davis leaned slightly sideways and glanced back. Behind them sat a young woman in a tight red dress, stretched comfortably across her seat like she had paid for the entire row. Her phone was in her hand, thumb scrolling lazily. She looked about 23, maybe 24, with glossy hair and a kind of confident expression that suggested the world usually moved out of her way. Next to her, by the window, sat another woman who looked older, probably her mother. She wore a bright pink blouse and white pants so perfectly pressed they looked fresh from a store display. Her lips were pursed in a permanent expression of irritation, like she had been annoyed long before boarding the plane. Lily turned just enough to meet the younger woman's eyes. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Your foot is on my seat." The girl looked down slowly, as if noticing the heel for the first time. "Oh," she said casually. Then she smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. "It's barely touching," she replied with a careless shrug. Instead of moving her foot, she shifted it slightly, pressing the heel down even more. The seat trembled again. Davis felt the irritation rise instantly, hot and sharp, but Lily stayed calm. She held the girl's gaze for a moment longer, giving her a chance to correct the behavior without embarrassment. Most people would. This girl didn't. Her attention had already returned to her phone. The older woman beside her leaned closer and muttered loudly enough for half the row to hear. "People are so dramatic these days." A couple of nearby passengers glanced over. Lily slowly turned back to face forward again. Her posture remained straight, composed, but Davis knew that look. She was trying to ignore it. Behind them, the heel shifted again. Press. The seatback pushed into Lily's shoulders. Davis leaned forward slightly and spoke calmly. "Hey," he said. "Could you move your foot please?" The girl looked up again. Her eyes slid over him slowly, measuring him the way someone studies a stranger who just interrupted their day. Then she tilted her head. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked. She asked nicely, Davis replied evenly. A quiet ripple moved through the nearby seats. People were starting to listen. The older woman suddenly straightened up. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Don't talk to my daughter like that." Davis kept his voice calm. "We just want the seat clear." But the young woman wasn't done. Instead of removing her foot, she pressed the heel down harder against the seatback. The message was clear. She wasn't confused. She was challenging them. And suddenly, what should have been a simple request had turned into something else entirely. Davis glanced at Lily. She didn't say anything. But the tension in her shoulders told him everything. This flight was going to be a long one. And somehow, he had a feeling this story was only just beginning. If you've ever been on a long flight, you probably know the unspoken rule everyone quietly agrees to the moment the plane leaves the ground. You respect the small space around you. No loud arguments. No kicking seats. No invading someone else's row like the cabin is your personal living room. Most passengers follow that rule without even thinking about it. But every once in a while, someone boards the plane who clearly believes the rules don't apply to them. That flight was supposed to be simple for Davis and Lily. Just a few quiet hours in the air, a little rest, maybe a movie, and then they'd land and continue their trip like normal people. Instead, somewhere between takeoff and cruising altitude, they found themselves stuck in one of the strangest situations they had ever experienced on a plane. It started with a red high heel resting on a seat. But it didn't end there. Because the woman behind them wasn't just stretching her leg. She was looking for a reaction. And when she didn't get the one she wanted, things started getting messy. What followed turned a quiet airplane cabin into a slow-burning drama filled with witnesses, cameras, airline crew, and two passengers who were absolutely convinced they were the victims. Davis didn't know it yet, but by the time that plane landed, half the cabin would be watching what happened next. And the woman with the red heel? She was about to learn a very uncomfortable lesson about what happens when entitlement meets patience, in a metal tube flying 30,000 feet above the ground. But to understand how everything spiraled out of control, you have to rewind a little. Because just 30 minutes earlier, the flight had been perfectly peaceful. And none of this drama had even started yet. About 30 minutes earlier, the flight had felt completely ordinary. Davis remembered thinking how smooth everything had been so far. No delays, no crowded boarding chaos, no loud passengers arguing over luggage space. Just a quiet evening flight cutting through the clouds. He and Lily had settled into their seats near the middle of the plane, the soft hum of the engines creating that familiar white noise that always made flying feel strangely peaceful. Lily had leaned back with a small smile, adjusting the strap of her bag beneath the seat. Finally, she had said quietly. It had been a long week for both of them. Work deadlines, travel planning, and the usual mess that life liked to pile on right before a trip. This flight was supposed to be the calm part, the moment where everything slowed down for a few hours. Davis had opened the in-flight entertainment screen while Lily looked out the window across the aisle. The sky outside had already turned dark, leaving only a faint reflection of the cabin lights against the glass. Passengers around them were settling in too. A man a few rows ahead had already fallen asleep before the plane even leveled out. A college-aged girl across the aisle was watching a movie with oversized headphones. Someone nearby was unwrapping a snack, the faint crinkle of plastic mixing with the steady engine noise. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet flight full of strangers sharing a temporary space in the sky. Lily had always been good at these kinds of situations. Calm, polite, the type of person who believed a little patience could smooth over almost anything. She rarely complained about small inconveniences. A delayed flight. She'd shrug. A crying baby in the cabin. She'd put on headphones and smile. Even when people were rude, Lily usually gave them the benefit of the doubt first. Davis admired that about her. He was, slightly less patient. Still, the two of them balanced each other well. Lily kept him calm, and he made sure no one took advantage of her kindness. As the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers relaxed even more. A few people stood up to stretch. Someone opened an overhead bin to grab a jacket. For a while, the flight felt almost peaceful. Davis had leaned closer to Lily and quietly asked if she wanted something to drink when the attendants came around. "Tea," she said with a small laugh. "I'm officially in travel mode." They both smiled. It was one of those simple moments couples shared when everything felt easy. Neither of them had noticed the two women sitting in the row directly behind them yet. At that point, they were just two more passengers on a plane full of strangers. But that would change soon. Because behind them sat a young woman who seemed to believe airplane seats were optional, and personal space was just a suggestion. And the woman sitting next to her, who Davis would soon learn was her mother, looked like the type who had never told her daughter the word "no" in her entire life. Within minutes, those two strangers would turn a quiet flight into a long, uncomfortable lesson in entitlement. And it all started with something as small as a shoe touching the back of a seat. The first thing Davis noticed about the two women behind them wasn't the heel on the seat. It was the attitude. Even before the problem started, there had been small signals, tiny clues that these weren't the kind of passengers who worried about the comfort of others. The younger woman sat diagonally across her seat like she was lounging on a couch instead of flying thousands of feet above the ground. One leg stretched sideways into the empty space between seats, the other occasionally bouncing as she scrolled through her phone. Her red dress was bright enough to stand out under the dim cabin lights, and the matching red heel that now rested on Lily's seat looked less like a shoe and more like a flag planted in someone else's territory. Her name, as Davis would later hear, was Eva. Eva carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected the world to adjust to her, not the other way around. Next to her sat her mother, Amanda. If Eva looked carefree, Amanda looked permanently annoyed. She sat upright with her arms folded, wearing a tight pink blouse and spotless white pants that made her look like she had stepped out of a fashion catalog moments before boarding. Her posture radiated the quiet authority of someone who believed she was always right, and was fully prepared to defend that belief. Amanda's eyes moved constantly around the cabin, judging everything. The slow boarding process. The cramped seats. The flight attendants pushing the drink cart. Even the passengers nearby. Every now and then she leaned toward Eva and whispered something that made the girl laugh softly, the kind of laugh that suggested they were both in on a private joke the rest of the cabin didn't understand. Davis noticed something else too. Neither of them seemed interested in blending into the quiet rhythm of the flight like everyone else. Most passengers tried to disappear into their seats during long flights. They read books, watched movies, or closed their eyes. Eva and Amanda did the opposite. They filled the space around them. Eva talked loudly while scrolling through her phone, occasionally tilting the screen toward her mother. "Look at this," she said at one point, laughing. Amanda leaned in, shaking her head with amusement. "People are ridiculous," she replied. Their voices carried easily through the row. At first, it was just background noise. But then Eva shifted sideways in her seat, stretching her leg out casually. That was when the red heel first appeared above Lily's seat. At first, it barely touched the leather. Just a light contact. Easy enough to ignore. But Eva didn't stop there. Slowly, almost lazily, she extended her leg farther. The heel settled fully onto the top edge of the seat back. Press. The movement was deliberate. Not aggressive, not dramatic. Just confident. Like someone claiming space that wasn't theirs and assuming no one would challenge it. Amanda noticed it too. Instead of saying anything, she simply glanced at the shoe, then leaned back with a satisfied little smile. It was the kind of look that said she already knew exactly how this situation would play out. Davis caught that expression in the reflection of the window beside him. And suddenly, the heel pressing into Lily's seat didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt like the beginning of a test. And unfortunately for everyone on that plane, Eva seemed very interested in seeing how far she could push it. At first, Lily decided to handle it the way she handled most uncomfortable situations. With politeness. She slowly turned around in her seat, just enough to face the young woman behind her. Her voice was calm and friendly, the kind of tone people usually responded to without thinking. "Excuse me," Lily said gently. "Your foot is pressing against my seat." For a moment, Eva looked confused. Or at least she pretended to be. She lowered her eyes toward the red heel resting on the seat back, studying it as if it had appeared there on its own. "Oh," she said casually. Then she shrugged. "It's barely touching." The words were delivered with a lazy smile, the kind that suggested the problem wasn't the shoe, it was Lily noticing it. Davis felt irritation rise immediately, but Lily remained patient. She gave Eva a small nod. "Could you move it, please?" There was a short pause. It was the kind of pause where a reasonable person would simply pull their foot back and the entire situation would end right there. Instead, Eva leaned farther back in her seat and looked at Lily like she had just asked something ridiculous. "Relax," Eva said. And then, almost as if to prove a point, she pressed her heel down harder. The seat jolted slightly. Lily's shoulders shifted forward from the pressure. That tiny movement was enough to change the atmosphere around them. A couple of nearby passengers looked up from their screens. Someone across the aisle lowered their book. Davis leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Hey," he said calmly. "She asked you nicely." Eva's attention moved toward him now. Her eyes scanned him slowly, almost amused. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked. The question wasn't confused. It was challenging. Davis kept his voice steady. "Because you ignored her." The girl tilted her head. "Well," she said, lifting her phone again, "maybe she should mind her own seat." The red heel remained exactly where it was. Behind Eva, Amanda suddenly straightened up. Her expression hardened instantly. "Excuse me," she said sharply. The word cut through the quiet cabin like a knife. She leaned forward slightly, glaring at Davis. "Don't speak to my daughter like that." Davis raised his hands slightly, keeping them visible. "I'm not being rude," he said calmly. "We just want the seat clear." Amanda scoffed loudly. "Oh please," she said, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "You people are acting like she kicked the chair." Eva chuckled softly beside her. "It's literally just a shoe," she added. And then, almost playfully, she tapped the heel against the seat. Tap. Tap. Each tap sent a vibration through the seat back into Lily's shoulders. Lily closed her eyes briefly. Not in anger. In patience. When she opened them again, she turned around once more, this time with a little more firmness in her voice. "I'm not asking for much," she said calmly. "Please remove your foot." Eva's smile slowly faded. For a second, she studied Lily's face carefully. Then she leaned forward slightly. "You're making this into a big deal," she said. And instead of removing the heel, she planted it down even harder against the seat. The seat back shuddered again. This time there was no pretending it was accidental. It was deliberate. And suddenly what had started as a simple request had turned into something else entirely. Davis could feel the tension spreading through the surrounding rows. People were watching now. Waiting. Because everyone on that plane could feel it. This wasn't just about a shoe anymore. It had become a challenge. And Eva clearly wasn't planning to back down. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The engines hummed steadily around them, and the cabin lights glowed softly overhead, but the quiet between the two rows of seats had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense. Lily slowly turned back around and faced forward again. Her posture stayed straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but Davis could see the tightness in her shoulders. She was trying to ignore it. Behind them, Eva shifted in her seat again. The heels scraped lightly across the top of the seat back. Then it settled. Press. The pressure returned, heavier this time. Lily's seat moved forward a fraction. Davis exhaled slowly through his nose. He leaned a little closer to Lily. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded slightly, though the small movement of the seat said otherwise. For a moment, Davis thought maybe the girl would get bored and move her foot. Instead, Eva seemed to enjoy the reaction. Tap. The heel nudged the seat again. Tap. Another push. Not strong enough to cause a scene. Just enough to remind them she was still there. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man lowered his newspaper and glanced over. A woman 2 rows ahead twisted around slightly, trying to see what was happening. Eva noticed the attention. And she liked it. She leaned sideways toward her mother, whispering something that made Amanda grin. "Some people are so sensitive," Amanda muttered loudly. The words carried easily through the row. Lily took another slow breath. Then she reached up and pressed the call button above her seat. The soft chime rang through the cabin. Eva froze for half a second. Then she laughed. "Seriously?" she said. Amanda rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh my God," she sighed. "They're calling the staff over a shoe." A few moments later, a flight attendant approached from the front of the plane, pushing the beverage cart slowly down the aisle. Her smile was professional, but her eyes immediately noticed the tension. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. Before Davis could speak, Lily calmly gestured toward the seat back. "She keeps putting her foot on my seat," Lily explained. The attendant glanced down. The red heel was impossible to miss. For a moment the attendant simply looked at it, then back at Eva. "Ma'am," she said politely, "please keep your feet off other passengers' seats." Eva sighed dramatically, like a teenager being asked to clean her room. "Fine," she muttered. She slid her foot down off the seat. The pressure disappeared instantly. Lily nodded politely. "Thank you." The attendant gave them all a quick reassuring smile before continuing down the aisle with the cart. For a moment, the tension eased. The cabin returned to its quiet rhythm. Passengers went back to their movies and books. Someone opened a snack bag nearby. The engines continued their steady roar through the night sky. Davis leaned back slightly. Maybe that was the end of it. But behind them, Eva wasn't finished. Her foot hovered just below the seat back for a few seconds. Waiting. Then slowly, very slowly, the red heel crept upward again. First the tip touched the leather. Then the entire sole pressed against the seat. Press. The seat shuddered once more. Davis closed his eyes briefly. That wasn't an accident. That was a message. Eva leaned back in her seat with a satisfied little smile, staring down at her phone as if nothing had happened. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper sighed and shook his head. Several passengers were watching again. Everyone could feel it now. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was intentional. And the girl behind them had just made it very clear that she wasn't afraid of consequences. Davis glanced at Lily. She met his eyes quietly. No words were needed. Because they both understood something at that exact moment. This situation wasn't going away. And the flight still had hours left before landing. By the time the heel returned to Lily's seat for the third time, Davis realized something important. Eva wasn't just being rude. She was performing. The way she moved, the way she spoke louder when people looked over, the little glances she threw around the cabin, it all felt calculated. Like she was waiting for the moment someone reacted strongly enough to make her the victim. Davis had seen that type of behavior before. People who created problems, then pulled out a camera the moment someone pushed back. He leaned back slightly and looked over his shoulder again. That's when he noticed it. Eva's phone wasn't just in her hand. It was angled toward them. The screen reflected the dim cabin lights, but he could clearly see the small red dot in the corner. She was recording. Eva tilted the phone slightly, pretending to scroll while the camera quietly captured everything happening in the row ahead. Amanda leaned closer to her daughter. "Make sure you get his face," she whispered. The words were quiet, but not quiet enough. Davis felt something shift inside his chest. So that was the plan. Create the conflict. Film the reaction. Control the story. Eva suddenly spoke louder than necessary. "Honestly," she said dramatically, glancing at her phone. "I've never been harassed on a flight before. A few passengers nearby looked up again. Amanda leaned toward the aisle, shaking her head in fake disbelief. "Some people just want attention," she said loudly. Davis almost laughed. The irony was unbelievable. But instead of reacting, he stayed quiet. Lily's hand gently touched his arm. "Let it go," she whispered. But Davis had already made a decision. If Eva wanted to build a story, then he would make sure the full story existed. Slowly, without drawing attention, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. He didn't raise it. He didn't point it at anyone. Instead, he unlocked it and opened the camera app, then placed it face up on his leg, angled slightly toward the aisle. The phone looked like it was just resting there. But the camera was recording. Every voice. Every movement. Every word. He didn't even need a perfect view. The audio alone would tell the story. Behind them, Eva continued her performance. She tapped the heel lightly against the seat again. Tap. Then she spoke loudly toward her phone. "I literally just stretched my leg," she said. The statement floated through the cabin like bait. Amanda nodded dramatically. "And now they're acting like criminals," she added. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper finally leaned forward. "Actually," he said quietly, "I saw her foot on the seat several times." Eva's smile faltered for half a second. Amanda turned sharply toward him. "Mind your business," she snapped. But the man didn't look away. He simply shrugged and returned to his seat. The tension thickened. At that exact moment, the plane jolted slightly as a pocket of turbulence rolled through. A few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign chimed on with a sharp ding. Eva took advantage of the moment instantly. She raised her phone higher now. "This is unbelievable," she announced. Her voice was loud enough for several rows to hear. "We're being targeted for no reason." Amanda leaned farther into the aisle. "That man keeps staring at us," she said, pointing toward Davis. Davis didn't respond. He simply let the camera continue recording. Lily squeezed his wrist gently. Her silent message was clear. "Stay calm." And he did. A flight attendant was already walking quickly down the aisle again, alerted by the raised voices. This time she wasn't alone. Another attendant followed behind her. Both of them stopped beside Eva's row. "What seems to be the issue now?" the first attendant asked. Eva immediately started talking. "She's accusing me of kicking her seat," she said, pointing forward. "She won't stop harassing us." Amanda added dramatically, "We don't feel comfortable anymore." The attendant looked confused. Then she turned toward Lily. Lily spoke calmly. She explained exactly what had happened. No exaggeration. No anger. Just the facts. "The foot has been on my seat several times," she said quietly. The attendant crouched slightly to examine the seat. Her eyes moved to the top edge of the leather. A faint scuff mark from the red heel was visible. Then she looked back at Eva. "Ma'am," she said more firmly now, "please keep your feet on the floor." Eva rolled her eyes. "I already moved it," she said. But the second attendant had already noticed something else. The phone. She pointed toward it. "You'll also need to stop recording other passengers," she said calmly. Eva blinked. "I'm allowed to film," she replied quickly. The attendant shook her head. "Not without consent on this flight." The confidence in Eva's face flickered. Just for a moment. The cabin had gone very quiet. Passengers were openly watching now. The balance of the situation had shifted. Eva lowered her phone slowly. Amanda crossed her arms, staring forward in silence. For several minutes, nobody said anything. The attendants moved away again. The plane continued through the night sky. And Davis kept his phone quietly recording. Because he had a feeling something else was coming. People like Eva rarely gave up control of a story that easily. And sure enough, only a few minutes later, she made another mistake. For a few minutes after the attendants left, the cabin finally grew quiet again. The tension that had been hovering in the air slowly settled, like dust after a storm. Passengers returned to their screens and books. The hum of the engines filled the silence once more. Eva sat back in her seat with her arms crossed, staring straight ahead. Her phone was no longer pointed at Davis and Lily. But the look on her face made it clear she wasn't happy. Amanda leaned toward her daughter and whispered something under her breath. Davis couldn't hear the exact words, but the tone carried enough meaning. They were angry. Not embarrassed. Angry. Lily kept her eyes forward, breathing slowly, refusing to engage again unless absolutely necessary. Davis admired that about her. Most people would have snapped by now. But Lily stayed calm. Patient. And patience was slowly turning into something else inside the cabin. Witnesses. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper glanced over again. This time he wasn't pretending not to watch. 2 rows ahead, the woman who had turned around earlier was still half facing them, clearly paying attention. The story had quietly spread through the nearby seats. People knew what had happened. And that mattered more than Eva realized. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the plane shook slightly again as it passed through another pocket of light turbulence. The seatbelt sign remained on. Passengers stayed seated. And that's when Eva made another move. She stood up. The motion was quick and careless, like the seatbelt sign didn't exist. Her shoulder brushed the seat as she stepped into the aisle. The sudden movement caused several heads to turn. A flight attendant near the front immediately looked up. "Ma'am," she called out, "please remain seated while the seatbelt sign is on." Eva ignored her. She stepped forward anyway, squeezing past the seats toward the restroom. But as she passed Lily's row, her hand dragged across the top of Lily's seat. Not hard. Not enough to look aggressive. Just enough to shake it again. A small tremor ran through the seat back. Lily stiffened instantly. Davis saw it clearly. And so did someone else. The lead flight attendant had been watching the entire aisle. Her eyes locked onto Eva immediately. "Ma'am," she said sharply now. "Return to your seat." Eva froze halfway down the aisle. A few passengers looked up from their screens. The entire row had gone silent again. Eva turned slowly, her expression already shifting into that same annoyed confidence she had worn earlier. "I'm just going to the restroom," she said. The attendant didn't move. "The seatbelt sign is on," she replied firmly. For a moment, it looked like Eva might argue again. But this time the cabin was watching too closely. She rolled her eyes dramatically and walked back toward her seat. As she sat down, Amanda leaned toward her immediately. "What happened?" she whispered. Eva shook her head irritably. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. But the damage was already done. The lead attendant had seen everything. And when she walked back down the aisle again, her expression had changed. She wasn't just keeping an eye on the situation anymore. Now she was documenting it. She stopped beside Eva's row. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "I'm going to need your name and boarding pass." Eva blinked. "What?" The question sounded less confident than before. Amanda straightened immediately. "Why?" she demanded. The attendant didn't raise her voice. "Because there have been multiple reports of interference with another passenger's seat and failure to follow crew instructions." Amanda scoffed loudly. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. Eva crossed her arms again. "She's exaggerating," she said, pointing toward Lily. But before the attendant could respond, another voice spoke up. The man across the aisle leaned forward. "I saw the foot on the seat," he said calmly. There was no anger in his voice. Just certainty. A second passenger spoke next. The woman 2 rows ahead turned around fully. I heard everything, she added. Suddenly the story Eva had been trying to control began slipping away from her. More passengers were watching now. Not with curiosity. With judgment. The attendant nodded slightly. Then she wrote something down on her small notepad. Eva's confidence cracked again. Just slightly. But Davis saw it. The situation had changed. This wasn't just a disagreement between 2 rows anymore. Now it had witnesses. Documentation. An airline crew paying close attention. Eva shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Amanda leaned closer, whispering quickly again. But their voices sounded different now. Less certain. Less powerful. Davis quietly reached down and stopped the recording on his phone. He didn't need it anymore. Because the truth had already begun building itself, piece by piece, inside the cabin. And the people around them had started putting the puzzle together. Eva thought she had been creating a story. But now the entire plane had become the audience. And the ending of that story was starting to write itself. By now, the quiet airplane cabin had turned into something very different. Not loud. Not chaotic. But aware. Passengers who had spent the first part of the flight minding their own business were now fully paying attention. Heads leaned slightly into the aisle. Screens were forgotten. Even the man with the newspaper had folded it completely. Everyone had seen enough pieces of the story to understand what was happening. And Eva could feel it. Her earlier confidence, the relaxed smile, the careless attitude, had started to fade. She sat stiffly in her seat now, arms crossed tightly, eyes locked forward. Amanda, however, refused to surrender the spotlight. She leaned out into the aisle again, shaking her head dramatically. This is unbelievable, she said loudly. We're being singled out for no reason. Her voice carried through several rows. A few passengers exchanged looks. The lead flight attendant remained calm. No one is singling anyone out, she said evenly. We're simply addressing a complaint. Eva leaned forward suddenly. She's lying, she said, pointing toward Lily. The accusation hung in the air for a moment. Several passengers looked toward Lily now. But Lily didn't react the way Eva seemed to expect. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she turned around slowly and looked directly at Eva for the first time since the argument began. Her expression was calm. Steady. I'm not lying, she said quietly. That was all. No insults. No drama. Just the truth spoken plainly. The simplicity of it seemed to frustrate Eva even more. Oh please, Eva scoffed. You're acting like I assaulted you. Amanda nodded immediately. Exactly, she added. People today are so dramatic. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken earlier sighed. You had your foot on her seat, he said calmly. Eva turned toward him instantly. Why are you even involved, she snapped. The man shrugged. Because I saw it. That answer seemed to annoy her even more. Amanda jumped in again. This whole thing is ridiculous, she said loudly. My daughter stretched her leg. That's it. But the cabin wasn't buying it anymore. Another passenger 2 rows behind leaned forward. I saw it too, a woman said quietly. Eva looked around suddenly. For the first time since the argument began, the attention in the cabin didn't feel like entertainment. It felt like judgment. The lead attendant spoke again. Ma'am, she said firmly, looking at Eva. This has been reported multiple times now. Please keep your feet on the floor and remain seated. Eva opened her mouth to respond, but the attendant continued before she could. And I'll remind you again that recording other passengers is not permitted. Eva glanced down at her phone. It was sitting uselessly in her lap now. Amanda leaned closer to her daughter and whispered something urgently. Davis couldn't hear the words, but the tone was different this time. It wasn't confident anymore. It sounded worried. The flight attendant finished writing a few more notes. Then she stepped away from the row. But the atmosphere in the cabin had already shifted completely. Eva wasn't the center of attention anymore. She was the problem. Passengers slowly turned back to their seats again, but the tension didn't disappear. It lingered in the air like static. Davis leaned slightly toward Lily. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I'm fine." But neither of them relaxed completely. Because sometimes when people realize they're losing control of a situation, they do something desperate. And Eva looked exactly like someone who wasn't ready to lose the spotlight yet. For several minutes, she sat silently beside her mother. Then she suddenly laughed. Too loudly. "People are unbelievable," she said, shaking her head dramatically. Amanda forced a smile. "Just ignore them," she whispered. But Eva wasn't ignoring anything. She was thinking. And judging by the look in her eyes, she was planning something. Davis noticed it immediately. People who created chaos rarely stopped halfway through the story. They pushed. They escalated. They tried one more time to regain control. And sure enough, only a few minutes later, Eva made one last move that would end the entire situation for good. For several minutes after the attendant stepped away, the cabin returned to a strange kind of quiet. Not the relaxed silence from earlier in the flight. This was the kind of silence that followed an argument, when everyone pretended to return to their own world but still kept one ear open. The engines droned steadily through the night sky. The seatbelt sign was still glowing above the aisle. And Eva sat motionless in her seat. At least on the outside. But Davis could tell she was furious. Her jaw was tight. Her fingers tapped against the armrest in a slow, irritated rhythm. Every few seconds she glanced around the cabin like she was measuring the people who had spoken up earlier. Amanda leaned closer to her daughter. "Just ignore them," she whispered again. Eva nodded slightly. But the expression on her face said something very different. People like Eva didn't like losing control. And right now, the story had slipped out of her hands. For a few minutes she stared forward without speaking. Then suddenly she unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was small, but Davis heard it immediately. Eva stood up quickly. "Where are you going?" Amanda asked quietly. "The restroom," Eva replied. The seatbelt sign was still on. The turbulence had eased, but the rule was clear. Passengers were supposed to remain seated. A nearby flight attendant noticed instantly. "Ma'am," she called from the aisle, "please remain seated while the seatbelt sign is on." Eva didn't stop. She stepped into the aisle anyway. The movement drew attention again. Several passengers lifted their heads as she walked forward between the rows. Davis watched carefully. Not because he expected another argument. But because something about her body language felt deliberate. As Eva passed Lily's seat, she slowed down slightly. Just for a second. Her hand brushed across the top of the seat back. Not a push. Not a hit. Just a slow, dragging motion across the leather. But the movement sent a noticeable tremor through Lily's seat. Lily's shoulders stiffened immediately. Davis saw it clearly. And so did someone else. "Ma'am." The voice came sharply from the aisle. The lead flight attendant had been watching from halfway down the cabin. Her expression had completely changed. This time there was no polite smile. "Return to your seat immediately." Eva stopped. She turned slowly. "I'm just going to the restroom," she said. Her tone carried that same dismissive confidence she had used earlier. But the attendant didn't move. "The seatbelt sign is on," she replied firmly. The cabin was silent again. Several passengers were openly watching now. Eva looked around briefly. For a moment it seemed like she might argue again. But something had shifted. This time she could feel the weight of the attention in the cabin. She rolled her eyes dramatically and walked back toward her seat. As she sat down, Amanda leaned toward her urgently. "What happened?" she whispered. Eva shook her head. "These people are insane," she muttered. But the lead attendant had already stepped closer to the row. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "I need your boarding pass." Eva blinked in surprise. "What? You've ignored multiple crew instructions," the attendant continued evenly. "And you've continued interfering with another passenger's seat." Amanda immediately jumped in. "That's not true," she snapped. The attendant didn't react. She simply waited. Eva slowly reached into the pocket of the seat in front of her and pulled out her boarding pass. Her confidence was cracking now. Just slightly. But everyone nearby could see it. The attendant took the pass and wrote something down on a small notepad. Then she looked toward the front of the plane. Another attendant had already picked up the intercom phone. Amanda noticed. "What are you doing?" she demanded. The lead attendant's answer was calm and direct. "We're notifying the captain." That sentence landed like a stone in water. A ripple moved through the nearby rows. Eva's posture stiffened instantly. "Over a seat," she said, disbelief creeping into her voice. The attendant didn't argue. "This is now a safety matter," she replied. Across the aisle, the man who had spoken earlier quietly shook his head. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks. For the first time since the flight began, Eva didn't have anything to say. She simply stared forward. Amanda opened her mouth as if to argue again, then slowly closed it. The reality of the situation was finally starting to settle in. Davis leaned back slightly in his seat. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel angry. Mostly he felt relieved. Because sometimes situations like this spiral out of control. But this time the truth had done something powerful. It had gathered witnesses. And once enough people saw the same thing, no one person could rewrite the story anymore. Eva had spent the entire flight trying to control the narrative. But now that narrative had reached the cockpit. And once the captain got involved, things usually didn't end well for the person causing the problem. The cabin grew quiet again. But this time it wasn't tense. It was expectant. Because everyone on that plane could feel it. The flight wasn't over yet. But the ending of the story had already begun. As the plane began its slow descent toward the city, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt completely different from earlier in the flight. The tension hadn't disappeared. But it had changed shape. Instead of arguments and raised voices, there was now a quiet anticipation hanging in the air. The kind of silence people fall into when they know something important is about to happen. Outside the windows, the dark sky had started to glow faintly with distant city lights. Far below, highways looked like glowing rivers of moving headlights. Inside the cabin, passengers were buckling their seatbelts and adjusting their seats upright. But in Eva's row, nobody moved. She sat rigidly in her seat, staring forward with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Amanda leaned toward her, whispering quickly. "Just stay calm," she murmured. "They can't actually do anything." But her voice didn't sound confident anymore. Davis noticed something else too. The flight attendants were moving differently now. Earlier they had walked through the aisle with the usual relaxed pace of a routine flight. Now their movements were deliberate. Focused. Every few minutes one of them glanced toward Eva's row. And once or twice, one of them disappeared briefly toward the cockpit before returning again. Lily sat quietly beside Davis, her posture relaxed now that the pressure on her seat had finally stopped. She leaned slightly toward him. "It's almost over," she whispered. Davis nodded. But he had flown enough times to know one thing. Sometimes the real ending of a situation like this didn't happen in the air. It happened after landing. The wheels touched the runway with a loud screech. A few scattered passengers clapped quietly. The plane rolled along the runway before slowing to a stop near the terminal. Normally, this was the moment when everyone reached for their phones and bags, eager to stand up. But tonight something unusual happened. The plane stopped. And no one was allowed to stand. The seatbelt sign stayed on. The cabin remained silent. Passengers glanced at each other with curious expressions. Then the intercom clicked. The captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few moments while ground staff come aboard." That sentence was enough. Everyone understood immediately. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper raised his eyebrows slightly. 2 rows ahead, a passenger quietly whispered, "Well, that explains it." Eva's posture stiffened instantly. Amanda leaned closer to her daughter. "What does that mean?" she whispered nervously. Eva didn't answer. The door at the front of the plane opened with a soft mechanical sound. A few moments later, 2 airport staff members stepped inside. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions serious. The lead flight attendant walked up to them immediately and spoke quietly, explaining the situation. Several passengers leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to see what was happening. Eva sat frozen in her seat now. Her earlier confidence had vanished completely. Amanda tried to recover the attitude she had earlier in the flight. "This is ridiculous," she muttered loudly. "We're being treated like criminals." But no one responded. The airport staff finished listening to the attendant. Then one of them turned and walked directly down the aisle. Toward Eva. The footsteps were slow and steady. The entire cabin had gone silent again. The staff member stopped beside Eva's seat. "Ma'am," she said politely, "we need you to step into the aisle with us." Eva looked up, stunned. "What? Why?" "We need to speak with you regarding a report from the flight crew." Amanda immediately jumped up halfway from her seat. "This is absurd," she snapped. "She didn't do anything." The staff member didn't raise her voice. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "we'll address everything in order." Eva hesitated for a moment. Then slowly she stood. For the first time since the flight began, she looked uncertain. She stepped into the aisle. Several passengers quietly watched as she moved forward toward the front of the plane with the staff. Amanda tried to follow. But another staff member gently blocked the aisle. "Please remain seated," he said. Amanda sank back into her seat, clearly furious but suddenly unsure of what to do. Up near the front of the plane, Eva began speaking quickly, trying to explain her version of events. But something had changed. This time she wasn't the loudest voice in the room. The lead flight attendant was calmly explaining everything that had happened. And there were witnesses. Passengers who had seen the heel on the seat. Passengers who had heard the argument. Passengers who had watched Eva ignore multiple warnings. The story Eva had tried to create earlier was falling apart piece by piece. Davis watched quietly from his seat. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel anger either. Mostly he felt something simpler. Relief. Because sometimes the best form of justice wasn't shouting back. Sometimes it was simply letting the truth stand still long enough for everyone else to see it. And tonight, that truth had finally caught up with Eva. Now, with the plane parked and the door open, the final consequences were about to begin. Once the airport staff stepped onto the plane, the energy in the cabin changed again. The tension that had been floating quietly for the last hour finally started to settle into something clearer. Resolution. Passengers were still seated, but almost everyone was watching the front of the plane where Eva now stood in the aisle beside the staff members. She looked very different from the confident girl who had laughed earlier in the flight. Her shoulders were stiff now, and the relaxed smirk she had worn for most of the argument was gone. Amanda, however, was still trying to keep control of the situation. From her seat she leaned forward, raising her voice toward the front. "She didn't do anything wrong," she called out. Several heads turned. The staff member standing beside Eva remained calm. "Ma'am," she said politely but firmly, "we're handling the situation." Amanda leaned back with a frustrated huff. But the damage was already done. Passengers nearby had heard everything. A few people shook their heads quietly. Up near the front, the lead flight attendant spoke calmly with the airport staff, explaining the events of the flight step by step. Eva tried to interrupt several times. "That's not what happened," she said quickly. But the attendant simply continued. "There were repeated warnings," she explained. "And multiple passengers witnessed the behavior." That last part mattered. Because now the situation wasn't just about one complaint. It was about an entire cabin full of witnesses. The staff member nodded as she listened. Then she turned toward the aisle behind her. "Did anyone nearby observe what happened?" she asked. There was a brief pause. Then the man across the aisle from Davis spoke first. "I did," he said calmly. His voice carried through the quiet cabin. "She had her foot on the seat multiple times." The woman 2 rows ahead raised her hand slightly. "I saw it too," she added. "And she was asked to stop." Another passenger nodded in agreement. The story Eva had been trying to control was now being confirmed by strangers she couldn't argue with. Eva looked around the cabin quickly. For the first time all flight, she seemed overwhelmed by the attention. Amanda tried one more time. "They're exaggerating," she said loudly. But the staff member raised a hand gently. "We'll review everything," she replied. Her tone made it clear the conversation wasn't a debate. Eva was asked to step closer to the front while the staff finished their report. As she walked forward, several passengers quietly watched her pass. Some people simply looked away. Others shook their heads. No one spoke to her. The quiet reaction said more than words could. Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers were finally allowed to begin exiting the plane row by row. The line slowly started moving. People stood up, grabbed their bags, and moved toward the door. But as they passed Lily and Davis's row, something unexpected happened. A few passengers paused briefly. The man who had spoken earlier gave Lily a small nod. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Lily smiled politely. "Thank you." A woman walking past leaned closer. "Some people just don't know how to behave," she said softly. Lily simply nodded again. She didn't seem interested in turning the situation into a victory. She just wanted the flight to be over. Davis admired that. Sometimes the strongest response to conflict wasn't winning the argument. It was staying calm long enough for the truth to become obvious. Eventually their row was called to exit. Davis stood up first and reached for their bag in the overhead compartment. Lily stood beside him, adjusting her jacket. As they stepped into the aisle, Davis glanced toward the front of the plane. Eva was still standing there with the airport staff. Amanda remained seated several rows back, arms crossed tightly and clearly unhappy. But the earlier confidence was gone. Everything about their posture now looked smaller. Quieter. Contained. When Davis and Lily reached the front of the plane, the lead flight attendant caught Lily's eye. "Thank you for your patience," she said sincerely. Lily smiled. "Thank you for handling it." The attendant nodded, then stepped aside so they could exit. The moment they stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal hit them. After hours inside the cabin, the space suddenly felt wide and open. Davis took a slow breath. Behind them, the quiet voices of airport staff continued discussing the situation with Eva. But Davis didn't turn around. He didn't need to see the rest. The outcome was already clear. Because sometimes accountability doesn't arrive with shouting or dramatic punishment. Sometimes it arrives quietly. In front of witnesses. With the simple understanding that actions eventually catch up with people. And tonight, that understanding had reached 30,000 feet in the air, and followed Eva all the way down to the ground. By the time Davis and Lily stepped fully into the terminal, the tension from the flight began to melt away. The airport around them buzzed with its usual late-night rhythm, rolling suitcases rattling across the floor, distant announcements echoing over the speakers, tired travelers moving in quiet lines toward baggage claim. For everyone else in that terminal, it was just another normal night of travel. But for Davis and Lily, the flight behind them still lingered in their thoughts. They walked side by side through the concourse, their pace slow and relaxed now that the stress of the situation had passed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Lily let out a long breath. "Well," she said softly, "that was something." Davis laughed quietly. "That's one way to describe it." They stopped near a large window overlooking the runway. Outside, the plane they had just left sat quietly beneath the airport lights, looking peaceful and harmless, nothing like the strange drama that had unfolded inside it only minutes earlier. Lily leaned slightly against the railing and looked out at the runway lights stretching into the darkness. "You know what the strange part is?" she said after a moment. "What?" Davis asked. "I don't think she ever expected anyone to push back." Davis thought about that. Eva's behavior suddenly made more sense when you looked at it that way. People like her often lived in a world where their actions went unchecked. Where small acts of rudeness were ignored. Where entitlement slowly grew because no one ever forced it to stop. Maybe that's why she kept escalating. First the heel on the seat. Then the mocking comments. Then the recording. Then the accusations. Each step had probably worked for her before. Until this time. This time there had been witnesses. Crew members. And a plane full of people who quietly decided they had seen enough. Davis shook his head slightly. "The funny part," he said, "is we never really did anything." Lily smiled. "That's exactly why it worked." She turned toward him. "You stayed calm," she continued. "You didn't yell. You didn't argue. You just let the situation show itself." Davis thought back to the moment he had almost lost his patience earlier in the flight. He remembered the pressure in his chest, the urge to stand up and confront Eva directly. If he had done that, the story might have looked very different. Eva had wanted a reaction. She had wanted something she could film, twist, and turn into her own version of events. But instead, all she got was patience. And patience has a strange way of exposing people. Because when someone keeps pushing against calm behavior, eventually everyone else starts noticing. Davis glanced around the busy terminal. Travelers were walking past them in every direction, completely unaware of the strange little story that had unfolded in the sky above them earlier. "Do you think she learned anything?" he asked. Lily considered the question. "Maybe," she said after a moment. Or maybe tonight was just the first time she realized the world doesn't always work the way she expects. Davis nodded slowly. Sometimes the biggest lessons didn't come from punishment. They came from consequences. From the quiet moment when someone realized their actions had finally caught up with them. And in Eva's case, that realization had happened in front of an entire airplane full of witnesses. No yelling. No revenge. Just the simple weight of accountability. Lily pushed away from the railing and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Come on," she said with a small smile. "Let's go home." Davis nodded and followed her into the flow of passengers moving through the terminal. Behind them, the plane they had just left continued preparing for its next flight. The cabin would be cleaned. New passengers would board. And the strange little drama from that evening would slowly fade into memory. But the lesson it left behind was simple. Respect for others isn't complicated. And when someone forgets that, sometimes all it takes is patience, witnesses, and a little time for karma to quietly do its work. As Davis and Lily disappeared into the steady flow of travelers moving through the airport, the noise of the terminal slowly swallowed the last traces of the strange flight behind them. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Announcements echoed overhead. People hurried toward baggage claim, rides, and connecting flights. To everyone else walking through that terminal, it was just another normal evening at the airport. But somewhere back on that plane, a very different ending was still unfolding. Eva and Amanda were still being spoken to by airport staff. Their earlier confidence had faded into quiet frustration, replaced by something far less comfortable, accountability. And that was the real lesson of the entire situation. Because the truth is, moments like this happen everywhere. On airplanes. In stores. On the road. Small acts of entitlement that people think no one will challenge. Sometimes those moments explode into loud arguments. Sometimes they turn into viral videos. But every once in a while, something different happens. Instead of shouting, someone stays calm. Instead of escalating, someone simply lets the situation reveal itself. And when enough people see the truth with their own eyes, the story starts writing its own ending. That's exactly what happened on that flight. Davis didn't raise his voice. Lily didn't lose her patience. The crew followed their procedures. Passengers quietly spoke up when asked. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth became impossible to ignore. No revenge. No dramatic confrontation. Just a simple chain of consequences. Sometimes karma doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. Sometimes it shows up quietly at 30,000 feet, and waits until the plane lands. And by the time the doors open, the lesson is already learned. But now we want to hear from you. If you had been on that flight, what would you have done? Would you have ignored the situation? Would you have confronted the passenger directly? Or would you have handled it the same way Davis and Lily did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about real-life moments where patience and karma collide in unexpected ways, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Because sometimes the most powerful moments don't come from shouting the loudest. They come from standing calm, while the truth speaks for itself.